martial law, Marcos enjoyed a regular round of golf at the Whack Whack Golf Club. He liked to play for high stakes, but it didn't pay to beat the president, who was a notoriously bad loser. But those who could afford to go on losing became part of his circle of cronies. And this was to be the era of crony capitalism. Few cronies were so trusted as Bobby Benedicto. He'd known Marcos since law school, and even helped him to arrange his affairs in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. A letter transferring $1 million from the Sandy Foundation is signed by Benedicto. Checks for an account in Geneva worth $37 million could be signed by both men. Notes on Benedicto's own notepaper show that he helped Marcos keep track of his hidden wealth. That's how we know that in 1975, Marcos had $30 million in 5 foreign banks. Marcos believed in buying the loyalty of men like Benedicto. His prize was a monopoly on the Philippine sugar industry. No sugar could be bought or sold without Benedicto's say-so. In a country where cane cutters are lucky to earn $1 a day, Benedicto would help Marcos make millions. It wasn't only the workers who suffered. Sugar dealers were forced to pay sweeteners as Marcos and Benedicto tightened the screws. The presidential papers itemized some of these donations. In just 3 weeks, one businessman donated over $100,000. Some was paid in cash. A Marcos aide notes that I personally counted it and placed the same in this records jacket. All this added up. A motion before the Philippine Supreme Court claims that in 1 year, Marcos and Benedicto pocketed $500 million. Government officials have been trying to trace Benedicto, who has fled the country. Used favorites like Benedicto to take charge of all the nation's resources and every big economic venture. Martial law gave him the power to manipulate the entire economy. With a stroke of the pen, he could seize his enemy's assets. In this way, he gave a newspaper to Imelda's favorite brother, Cocoy Romualdez, and a $400 million electric plant that had belonged to a rich family opposed to Marcos. Herminio Decini, an in-law, had a small cigarette filter business. Marcos slapped a tax on his rivals and made him a millionaire. Marcos awarded construction contracts worth $1 billion to Rudy Cuenca. The Marcoses were the biggest shareholders in his company. Marcos put Danding Coenco in charge of the coconut board. Government auditors now claim he pumped $100 million of its dollars into a coconut scheme he owned. Coenco, like Decini, Romualdez, and Benedicto, fled the country with Marcos. Much of the finances for Marcos's business buddies came from public funds.
Mr. Marcos was an absolute dictator in this country. He was not just a president. And therefore, institutions like the Development Bank were operating completely under his control. There's no seeking the loan. They would just come around here and say that we need $100, $200 million for this project, which looks viable. It's not viable, but Marcos says it is viable. When he says that, then it better be viable. For instance, we were recently sent an account for $65 million that we are supposed to pay. Now, apparently, this money was supposed to have put up a steel mill factory. It's got to be pretty big because under our currency, that would be more than 1 billion pesos. So we asked to see where the factory is, and to this day, after several months, nobody has found it. In short, the factory does not exist.
But $65 million is just a drop in the bucket. The bank's newly appointed governors are still trying to trace billions that were given out as loans and never repaid.
From this bank alone, I'd say easily about $3.5 billion US dollars. And broken down roughly, say about $200 million for the Vicini Group, $100 million in the Benedictos, which is the former ambassador to Japan, the Cuencas, $65 million, the Cojuancos and the Romualdeses, about $50 million each. But this is not all. We should be able to multiply this by at least a factor of 3 to take into account the exposure of the government and other financial institutions.
Perhaps the best documented example of how Marcos enriched himself is the story of the North-South Highway. To build it, the Department of Public Highways had to import a large amount of heavy construction equipment, much of it bought from Japan. And inevitably, the Marcoses took a cut, 15% to be precise. Once again, the point man in the highway scam was Bobby Benedicto, who Marcos had made the Philippines ambassador to Japan.
Whenever Japanese corporations might want to invest in the Philippines, they needed, of course, to talk to the Philippine ambassador to Japan, which was Benedicto. And before any venture or project was approved, money had to change hands. And this was the role of Benedicto, was to set the terms of the bribe.
The presidential papers contain many like this, which adds up the value in yen of the road building equipment, then works out what 15% of that is and converts it into the dollars to be collected. In just one 5-month period, these kickbacks amounted to $2.7 million. There's nothing exceptional about this. In the Marcos era, nothing from tin sardines to dump trucks could enter Manila Harbor without the president getting his rake off. The skim for spare parts on heavy equipment could go as high as 26%. To get his payoffs out of the country, Marcos turned to his Minister of Highways, a certain Balthazar Aquino, no relation of Cory Aquino's.
Balthazar Aquino claimed that he was coerced into acting as an emissary for Marcos with the Japanese corporations. He made several trips to Japan to transmit messages regarding arrangements on commissions and kickbacks.
Marcos's bagman was sworn to secrecy. He wrote this note for the president. I assure you, sir, that I will never open my mouth, even if it will curse my life. But Aquino has now confessed that every 2 weeks he was laundering payments worth $400,000, $500,000 or $600,000 through money changers in Hong Kong. Here, Aquino converts Japanese yen into $600,000. He then deposits the dollars in the Hong Kong branch of the Swiss Bank Corporation, which telexes them to Freiburg in Switzerland, quiet, discreet, and well off the beaten track.